My name is Sarah. I am 30 years old, and I work as a 911 dispatcher. I have worked that job for 6 years, sitting in a room with no windows, wearing a headset, and talking to strangers during the worst moments of their lives. It is not glamorous. It does not come with a fancy title or a corner office or a wardrobe that turns heads at parties. But it is mine, and I have never once been ashamed of it. Until the night of my brother's engagement party, I never had a reason to defend it either. That evening changed things. Not because I suddenly became someone different, but because the truth had been quiet for a very long time, and sometimes the truth gets tired of waiting. My brother Daniel got engaged in October. His fiancée's name was Brooke. She was tall, polished, and the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately knew exactly how much everything in it cost. I am not saying that as an insult. It was simply how she moved through the world, with a confidence built entirely on measurements. Square footage, salary, zip code. Daniel was an architect at a firm downtown, which apparently cleared some kind of invisible bar for her. I, on the other hand, sat in a dispatch center and answered emergency calls. That, as I would soon learn, did not clear any bar at all. The engagement party was held at Brooke's parents' house in a suburb about 40 minutes outside the city. I drove there alone that Saturday evening, following the GPS through a neighborhood where every house looked like it had been designed to impress the house next to it. Circular driveways, manicured hedges, outdoor lighting that turned ordinary shrubs into something from a magazine. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a moment. I was wearing a dark green dress I had bought 2 years ago for a friend's wedding. It still fit. It was nice enough. I told myself that and got out of the car. The front door was open when I walked up, and I could already hear the murmur of conversation and the soft sound of jazz coming from somewhere inside. Brooke's mother greeted me at the entrance. She was warm in the way that people are warm when they have been trained to be gracious, practiced, a smile that arrived a half-second too quickly. She told me how lovely it was to finally meet me and gestured toward the back of the house where most of the guests had gathered on a large covered patio. The patio was beautiful, I will admit that. String lights hung overhead in soft loops, and long tables were arranged with white linens and small floral centerpieces. A catered spread was laid out along one side, real food, not appetizers, not the kind of party where you leave hungry. Someone handed me a glass of sparkling water as I stepped outside, and for a few minutes I just stood near the edge of the group, taking in the space. Daniel found me almost immediately. He looked happy. Really, genuinely happy, and I felt a warmth in my chest when I saw his face. He hugged me and said he was glad I made it, and introduced me to 2 of his architect colleagues standing nearby. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, in particular the drive out, the weather, how the firm had been busy lately. It was easy and comfortable, the way it always was with my brother. Brooke appeared at Daniel's side about 20 minutes later. She kissed him on the cheek and turned to me with a smile that was a slightly more rehearsed version of her mother's. She said it was great I could come. I told her congratulations, and I meant it. Whatever I thought of Brooke's particular way of measuring people, she made my brother happy, and that mattered more to me than anything else. Dinner began shortly after. Guests found their seats at the long tables, and I ended up toward the middle, across from 2 of Brooke's college friends and diagonal from an older couple I didn't recognize. The seat to my right was empty for a while, and then Brooke's father settled into the chair at the head of the table closest to our end. His name was Richard. He was a man in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and a quiet manner that felt like it had been earned rather than assumed. He greeted the people around him briefly and then focused on his plate. The dinner conversation flowed easily. Brooke's friends were talking about a trip to Portugal. My brother was answering questions about a project his firm had recently completed. The older couple across from me turned out to be neighbors of Brooke's parents who had known her since she was in elementary school. It was maybe 40 minutes into dinner when Brooke stood up and tapped her champagne glass. The conversation around the table settled, and she smiled out at everyone with the natural ease of someone who had been giving toasts since she was old enough to reach a microphone. She said some lovely things about Daniel. She talked about how they met, about the night he proposed, about how she knew almost immediately that he was the kind of man her father would respect. People laughed and smiled and raised their glasses. Daniel looked a little embarrassed in the way men do when they are being talked about lovingly in front of a crowd. Then Brooke turned and looked down the table in my direction. "I want to introduce Daniel's sister," she said pleasantly. "For those of you who haven't met her yet, she's been a little hard to get to know, but she did make it tonight." I smiled. I felt the eyes of the table shift toward me. Brooke continued, still smiling. "She works in emergency services." She gestured toward me with her champagne glass in a way that felt almost like a dismissal. "She's a dispatcher. You know, the people who answer the phones when you call 911. She paused just a beat too long. "Not exactly saving lives, but someone has to take the calls, right?" There was a short ripple of laughter from a few of Brooke's friends. Someone said, "Oh, that's interesting," in the tone that meant the opposite. One of the college friends nodded along with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I kept my expression neutral. I had a sip of water. I had heard variations of this before, not always from Brooke, not always at a dinner party. But the substance was familiar. The gentle belittling. The implication that what I did existed somewhere at the bottom of a hierarchy that people like Brooke had spent years building in their heads. I didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned a long time ago that arguing at someone else's table, at someone else's party, on someone else's special night, never ends the way you hope it will. So, I smiled quietly and let the moment pass. But Richard didn't laugh. I noticed it from the corner of my eye first. While the table around us returned to conversation, Brooke's father had gone very still. He wasn't looking at his plate anymore. He was looking at me. Not in a rude way, not aggressively. It was more like the expression a person has when they walk into a room and realize they've been there before in some other version of their life. And they can't quite find the memory to match the feeling. I looked at him once, briefly, then looked away. I thought maybe he was just reacting to his daughter's comment in some delayed way. Maybe he disapproved. Maybe he was distracted. I didn't want to stare. The table moved on. One of Daniel's colleagues started a story about a project deadline and everyone leaned in. Brooke sat back down beside my brother, and they fell into quiet conversation about the dessert that was apparently coming. Normal party sounds filled the space again, laughter, silverware, the soft jazz still playing somewhere inside the house. But Richard was still looking at me. I noticed it again a few minutes later. He had set down his fork. He was not participating in the conversation around him. He was sitting back slightly in his chair, and every few seconds his gaze came back to my face. Not unsettling, not intrusive, more like someone working through a very long calculation and not quite arriving at the answer. His wife touched his arm. "Everything okay?" she asked him quietly. He nodded once. "Fine. Just thinking." She gave him a small look and went back to her conversation. A few minutes passed. I was talking to the neighbor woman across from me about a community garden she had started in her backyard, something about tomatoes not doing well in partial shade, when Richard leaned forward slightly and said, "Excuse me." I turned toward him. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. His voice was measured. Careful. He had the manner of a man who did not speak often without meaning to. "I have to ask you something." "Of course," I said. He studied my face for a moment. "You said you work as a 911 dispatcher." Yes. He nodded slowly. He looked down at the table, then back at me. "How long have you worked there?" "About 6 years," I told him. He was quiet again. His wife had stopped talking and was watching him now with a small line between her brows. Brooke had glanced over from her end of the table, mildly curious but not concerned. "What county?" he asked. "Which dispatch center?" I told him. I named the county and the center. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, not dramatic, not a gasp, not a sudden sitting up straight. It was the quiet kind of shift, like something that had been slightly out of focus finally going clear. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, slowly, "Do you happen to remember a call?" 2 years ago. The first week of March. The table had gotten a little quieter. People were noticing the exchange without quite knowing what they were noticing. "I take a lot of calls," I said honestly. "Hundreds every month." He nodded. "I understand." He paused. It was a cardiac event. He glanced down. A heart attack. I was alone in my car, in the parking garage of a building downtown. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. I had called 911 before I fully understood what was happening. I thought it was indigestion at first. By the time I realized it wasn't, I could barely keep my hand steady enough to hold the phone. The table was fully quiet now. Even Brooke had stopped talking. The dispatcher who answered, he continued, stayed on the line with me for 23 minutes. He looked at me. She kept me calm. She talked to me the entire time. She told me to stay in the car, not to try to move, not to hang up. She walked me through everything until the paramedics got there. He paused again. I lost consciousness twice. She talked me back both times. No one at the table made a sound. Richard looked at me steadily. He said, I still don't know for certain. I never got her name. The paramedics came, and everything after that was a blur. But the dispatch center was the same, and the voice. He stopped. He shook his head slightly. I have thought about that voice many times in the past 2 years. It was very calm, very steady, like she had done it 1,000 times, but was still treating mine like the only one that mattered. I felt something tighten in my throat. I looked at him. He asked quietly, was it you? I held his gaze. The parking garage, I said. The Meridian building downtown? He exhaled. You were in a gray sedan, I said. You told me your daughter was getting married someday, and you were not going to miss it. Richard's jaw tightened. He looked away for a moment, toward the string lights above us. When he looked back, his eyes were bright. That was you, he said. It wasn't a question anymore. I nodded once. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The jazz playing inside the house was the only sound. Then Richard straightened in his chair and turned toward the table. His voice was composed, but it carried the weight of something he had been waiting a long time to say. My daughter introduced this woman tonight as someone who answers phones, he said. He did not say it with anger. He said it the way you say something that is simply, undeniably true, and needs to be said out loud. I want to make sure everyone here understands what that actually means. He looked around at the faces watching him. 2 years ago, I had a massive cardiac event alone in a parking structure. No one knew where I was. I had maybe minutes. And the person on the other end of that call did not simply answer the phone and transfer the call to someone else. She stayed with me. She monitored my breathing. She told me when to slow down, when to breathe through it, when to focus on her voice and nothing else. She spoke to me like I was a person, not a case number, not a call in a queue. And she did not let go until help arrived. He looked at me directly. I would not be sitting at this table tonight, he said quietly. I would not be watching my daughter get engaged. I would not have walked her down the aisle or held my grandchildren or had any of the mornings I have had in the last 2 years if that dispatcher had treated her job as just answering phones. The silence that followed was complete. I became aware of my own heartbeat. I became aware of the string lights and the white tablecloths and the faces of people I mostly didn't know all turned toward me. I felt the familiar, uncomfortable weight of being seen in a way I was not prepared for. I looked down for a moment. I pressed my hands flat against the table. Then Brooke's voice came from the far end. It was quiet. I looked up. She was looking at her father. Her champagne glass was still in her hand, but she had set her elbow on the table and she was looking at him with an expression I had not seen on her face all evening. Something had gone out of it. The performance of it, the management of it, it was just gone. She looked like a daughter watching her father say something she had needed to hear for a very long time and realizing it was not meant for her. She looked at me. I looked back at her. She opened her mouth and then closed it. She set the champagne glass down. Daniel reached over and put his hand over mine on the table. He didn't say anything. He just kept his hand there. Richard turned back to me one more time. I want to thank you, he said simply. I have wanted to say that to someone for 2 years. I didn't know who to say it to. He glanced around the table briefly. Now I know. I shook my head slightly. I told him what I always believe and have always believed, even on the hard nights, even on the calls that stay with me for weeks. I told him it was my job, and I loved my job, and I was glad he was there. He smiled then. It was a tired smile, a real one. He said, that's exactly what she would have said. The catering staff came out a few minutes later with dessert. Plates were set down. Someone poured more coffee. The conversation at the table resumed. Gently, like water finding its level again after being disturbed. But things were different. I noticed it in the way people made eye contact with me now, not past me. The neighbor woman asked me about the job, sincerely, leaning forward with her chin in her hand. One of Daniel's colleagues said he had never thought about what dispatchers actually did during a call and asked me to explain it. I told him a little. Not too much. It's not something that translates well to dinner conversation. Brooke did not say much for the rest of the evening. She stayed close to Daniel. She talked with her mother and with a few of her friends. But the ease she had carried into the party was quieter now, less certain of itself. At one point, she walked past me on her way to the dessert table, and she stopped for just a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. It was low, almost underneath the sound of the party. For what I said earlier. I looked at her. I told her I appreciated that. She nodded once, and then she moved on. It wasn't a movie moment. There was no tearful hug, no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden transformation. She was who she was. But she had said the words, and she had meant them, and sometimes that is enough for one evening. Richard found me near the end of the night, when guests were beginning to say their goodbyes. He shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. He said he hoped I knew that the work I did mattered. Not in the abstract, diplomatic way that people say things like that. He said it looking me directly in the eyes, and I understood that he was not speaking philosophically. He was speaking from a parking garage in the first week of March, 2 years ago, when the lights were dim and he couldn't feel his left arm, and a voice he had never heard before told him to stay calm and stay with her. I drove home that night with the windows cracked and the radio low. The suburbs gave way to the highway, and the highway gave way to the city, and the city opened up around me in its familiar sprawl of headlights and storefronts and apartment windows going dark. I thought about the calls I would take Monday morning. I thought about what it means to do a job that most people do not think about until the moment they need it desperately. I thought about the distance between the way work looks from the outside and what it actually is when you are inside it, doing it at 2 in the morning, keeping your voice level while someone on the other end of the line is terrified. I have never needed anyone to stand up for me at a dinner party. I did not need it that night, not really. I knew what my job was worth. I have always known. But there is something that happens when the truth that you have carried quietly for a long time is finally said out loud by someone else. Something settles. Not because you needed the validation, but because the world occasionally does catch up to what is real, and when it does, it is worth noticing. Daniel texted me that night before I fell asleep. He said, "I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell me about calls like that?" I thought about it for a minute. Then I wrote back, because the calls aren't mine to talk about. They belong to the people who made them. He took a while to respond. Then he wrote, "I'm really proud of you, you know that?" I set the phone down on my nightstand. I looked at the ceiling for a moment in the dark. I thought about Richard saying he told me on that call that his daughter was getting married someday, and he was not going to miss it. I had not remembered that detail until he said it. I had remembered the call, the gray sedan, the parking structure, the sound of his breathing going uneven and then steadying again. But I had not remembered that specific detail until he said it. Now I remembered it clearly. He had said it somewhere around the 14th minute, when the fear in his voice had started to give way to something steadier, when he was beginning to believe he might actually make it. He had said it almost as if he was reminding himself. My daughter is getting married someday, and I'm not going to miss it. I had told him then, "That's right. You're not. Keep breathing. Stay with me." He had stayed. And 6 days ago, at a party in a house with circular driveway and manicured hedges, surrounded by string lights and white tablecloths, and a table full of people who had never thought much about what a dispatcher actually does, he had walked through the front door. Sometimes the work you do quietly, in a room with no windows, with nothing but a headset and a steady voice, and the absolute refusal to let go, sometimes that work follows you into the world in ways you don't expect. Sometimes it finds you at a dinner party, sitting across from the man you talked back from the edge of something you never discussed in polite company. And sometimes the people who called you just a phone answerer are sitting at the same table when it does. I don't say that with any particular satisfaction. I say it because it is true, and because true things are worth saying. I fell asleep that night thinking about Monday's shift, about the calls that would come in, about the people who would dial those 3 numbers in the dark, in parking garages and living rooms and highway shoulders, and hear a voice they had never heard before telling them to stay calm and stay with us. That is the job. That is all of it. And that is more than enough.